the ascent to the highest place is preceded by the descent into the lowest abyss. And that's a good thing to know. It's like, why bother investigating the dark side of things? Maybe so that you can become the master of the dark side of things. Maybe so that the dark side of life no longer intimidates you, or at least doesn't intimidate you to the point where you lose your moral virtue in your cowardice, right? And so you look at what's darkest and you do that voluntarily. And the consequence of this, and I believe this to be true physiologically, is that you will develop into the sort of person who can withstand that exposure. So we talked earlier about the different psychophysiological pattern that characterizes your being if you voluntarily undertake a challenge rather than have it inflicted on you. Okay, so now imagine that you practice that voluntary exposure. Now you embody that pattern of reaction more and more habitually. So it starts to become built into you, right? Because you become what you practice. Okay, built in at what level? If you undertake new adventures, so you live on the edge, new genes turn on inside you. So in your genetic code is a repository of possibility, which will not be coded on unless you put yourself in the situation that challenges you such that that revelation of possibility becomes necessary. That's true all the way down to the molecular level. So imagine that you conducted yourself in this shadowy manner so that you were attending to everything that terrifies you and others in the most diligent possible manner. That turns you into the sort of person who can do exactly that. And so God, then what? Then what? What does that imply? That you can handle anything that comes your way, right? At least without becoming corrupted. And maybe in a manner that's useful to yourself, maybe even a manner that's grateful. Job, in the story of Job, Job is tormented by God and Satan, right? Job is regarded by God as a good man. And Satan comes along and says, I don't think he's so good. I think he's just lucky. And God says, and Satan says, why don't you just give him to me for a little while and we'll see if he rejects you. And God says, yeah, I don't think he will. Have at him. And so Job loses everything, right? Everything collapses around him. He doesn't deserve it. His children die. His businesses are demolished. He gets a terrible disfiguring disease. He's sitting in the ashes. And his friends come along and tell him how he deserves his fate. And Job's response, magnificent response, is number one, to point out to himself and the observers and God that his ignorance is total about the fundamental meaning of things and that he has no right to judge existence in its essence regardless of what happens to him. That he determines that he will maintain faith in his own fundamental character and in the spirit of being itself no matter what happens to him. And he manages that. It's a remarkable moral achievement. And the consequence, by the way, is that he gets back everything he lost and more. You know, and you might say, well, the ends don't justify the means, let's say, with regard to God. But part of the story is, if you don't lose faith when the trials of fate come your way, God only knows what vistas of possibility might open up in front of you. I'll tell you one more story on the Jungian side to close this off. This is something truly remarkable and the kind of thing you learn if you throw yourself into the Jungian analytical world, which opens up the meaning of great literature in a bottomless manner. And I think partly does that by highlighting the associations between literary themes that are universal in the same way that AI language model systems do it. There's a scene in Exodus. So the Israelites are making their way to the promised land. So they're on a journey. They're going from point A to B. They have a destination in mind and it's upward, right? And they've wandered through the desert, which they encountered after dropping their tyrannical presuppositions. And they've been lost for generations. And now they're finally on the edge of attaining their end. But they lose faith. They lose faith and they revert to a kind of immature bickering and complaining. And they long for the reliable and secure days of the pharaonic tyranny, and they accuse Moses and his compatriots of being nothing but tyrannical power mongers who've led them astray. And they've done this multiple times while they're lost, wandering stupidly through the desert. And God and Moses are both kind of tired of it. And so God sends snakes amongst the Israelites, poisonous snakes, to give them a good biting. And you might think, well, that's kind of cruel because they're already having a rough time. And why make it worse, especially if you're God? And the proper rejoinder to that is, People have free will, and there's always something stupid you can do to make a bad situation worse. And the Israelites are definitely doing that, and they know it. And so in come the snakes and biting them like mad. And after they get good and tired of that, which I suppose takes a while given their intransigence, they go to Moses, whom they know to have a pipeline to God. And they say, do you want to see if you can get the big guy upstairs to call off the snakes? And Moses says, well, I'll see what I can do. And he goes and has a conversation with God. And God says, I don't think I'm going to get rid of those snakes. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll tell you what you can do. You gather up all the bronze that the Israelites have in their possession. You make a gigantic staff, like the staff of Moses, which is the staff of tradition. And you put a serpent on that, a poisonous serpent. And then you have the Israelites go look at that. Gather them around so they can see it and gaze at it. And then the poison of the snakes will no longer affect them. Okay, so what's the idea? Now that staff with a symbol around it, we already said that's the symbol of healing. A little of the poison that kills you protects you. If you gaze upon the things that are terrible and challenging, you become immune to their poison. That's the message of that story. And more, God is constituted such that he would rather make people strong than safe. That's a definition of God, by the way. The paternal spirit that would rather make his children strong than safe. Right, that's emblematic of that story. Take the Israelites who are being poisoned by their own iniquity, have them contemplate what's poisoning them, and they will become stronger in consequence. Okay, so that's a remarkable story of the beneficial consequences of voluntary exposure.